Well, hello, Mrs. Westfalls class. I'm really excited to hear that you guys have been reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography. It is one of the great works of American history, and I hope that you've really enjoyed it and all of its complexity. Frederick Douglass is one of the greatest historical figures in American history. One of my favorite historians, David Blight, he wrote this book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. And he argues in there that Douglass is one of the most important and often overlooked American historical figures. And so my task to you, Mrs. Westfall asked about talking to you about the importance of studying history. And the most important, and Douglass is a really good example of that, because Douglass points the way to us in his autobiography for why it's so important to study history. Very forthrightly, in the first lines of his autobiography, he says, I do not know who my father is, but it is rumored that my master is my father. And then within the rest, some of the rest of it, and you read it carefully, and it's crazy because some of the stuff that goes on there, like it is. He very forthrightly talks about, of course, how the masters often raped their slaves and had children with the slaves, thereby satisfying their desires and their profits, making money off of it. But then when that slave child, which is now, the son of the master and of the slave woman, when it starts to become of age, you have this situation where the master may have to whip his son. And I don't mean like spank, I mean whip. And then you have a situation too where his other white son that he has with his wife, the father has with his wife, will have to whip his brother. Which is like, so then what happens is they're like, we got to sell. And so human beings are just bought and sold as property. We got to sell to get rid of this boy, because that boy is also a reminder to what everyone is trying to pretend doesn't happen. Because the mistress, which is the wife of the slave owner, in her mind, she knows where this child came from, but yet everybody's in denial, which can be a strong thing. Like, you don't want to know that your husband is actually sleeping with slaves and having babies with them. And when you have a living, breathing reminder, that is the child, best to sell the child. So often the child would then be sold and never see its mother again, and it would be sold into human bondage by its father so that its half-brother doesn't have to whip him. So that beginning of that autobiography just blows me away. And here's why it's so important. Because Oklahoma recently passed a law that said we cannot teach things that might make people feel uncomfortable. And we can't teach that one race is inherent, that the United States is a racist country and things like that. But historically, in the Constitution, it says that slavery is legal because they're only 3/5 of a person. They're not fully human. And my point is that more recently there's been attempts to whitewash our history. And that's so sad, because history is so important that it be confronted directly. Because how else are we going to learn from it? How else are we going to get better? I mean, I like to think that we, as human beings, that we're making progress and we're doing better and working towards greater equality and a better life and more individual rights and freedoms and values that all Americans value. But if we don't confront this and we pretend that it didn't happen, then we cannot overcome problems for today. Another good example is I've got German exchange students. Max, last year I've had at least a half a dozen or a dozen German exchange students over the years. I went to Germany, I went to Munich, I went to Nuremberg, where they had Nazi rallies, and they confront their own history. And they you know, and my German exchange students, they know about the Holocaust. They know about the sins of the Nazi people and the German people and what they did wrong. They confront that history, and they are very sensitive. I had a German exchange student 10 years ago, and somebody had said a statement that was prejudicial. It wasn't outright, like, you know, just blatantly racist, but it had undertones of racism. And my German exchange student got mad because they're like, it did not tolerate that, because they've confronted that. We never really confronted some of this history, and there's a good reason for that, because in history it's called, the Southerners called redemption. They regained control. They instituted Jim Crow laws. They had the sharecropping system, and they had convict labor, which all reduced African Americans to what we call slavery by another name. And this is really, really important, because it shaped how we remembered this. So then it was this idea that, oh, the South, they weren't fighting for slavery, they were fighting for states' rights, and their cause was just and valiant. And then they start putting statues up of Robert E. Lee. And they named military bases after Confederate generals. And that was, you know, later during this period. Those military bases just last year were renamed. They got rid of all the Confederate names. And I heard some people complaining about that because they don't like change. And they're like, I went to Fort Benning, and I was at Fort Benning as well, right? And they're like, I'll never call it anything else. It's Fort Benning. They shouldn't change that name. But I want you to think about the way we remember that history was that we're going to name a military base after someone who committed treason against the country, which is what all of the people who took up arms against the country in the Civil War did. But we don't look at it that way, and instead we romanticize Robert E. Lee and these other figures and be like, oh, they fought, you know, for a just cause. No, they were fighting to keep people enslaved. So that's just one example why studying history is so important, because we have to take an honest, objective view of history. If we do not, then it will be twisted and distorted to serve other people's purposes. And nobody's a better reminder for that than Frederick Douglass, because in his writings, Frederick Douglass, he hits us over the head with it, you know? And I love his writings and this biography. And that's why David Blight, the historian, one of my favorite historians, considers him to be one of the most important people in U.S. history, and I think he is. So I hope that helps you with your paper and with your project. And if any of you want to come by and visit and ask me questions, I'm happy to answer them as we have time. And hope this helps. And thank you, Miss Westfall, for introducing them to Frederick Douglass. It's wonderful. Bye.